Shalawam, Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai Barakatah, and welcome to the reading of the KJV Cross-Reference Study Bible by Barbour. Follow along with me today as I read the study notes for Jeremiah, the 20th chapter to the 25th chapter. One of the religious leaders for sure hears what Jeremiah has said. He has Jeremiah physically abused. Upon his release, Jeremiah renames Pashur Magor Misabib, which means terror on every side, an indicator of how Judah will soon be surrounded by Babylonian invaders. Jeremiah's message from Yahweh is clear. Because the religious leaders no longer recognize the words of the true power, Yahweh will come harshly and completely. The passages from 7 to 18 include one of Jeremiah's numerous laments to Yahweh. The cost to Jeremiah for his boldness is great, and his confidence gives way to despair. Jeremiah sets out his complaint. On one level, he complains about his unjust treatment. He's the object of public ridicule, a laughingstock. He is mocked, and his obedience has resulted in reproach and derision all day long. Jeremiah trusts Yahweh. But in these verses, he admits to feeling like Yahweh has taken advantage of him. The prophet feels he is in a no-win situation. If he speaks Yahweh's word of judgment, he is the object of mockery, ridicule, and hostility. If he doesn't speak, then Yahweh's word is like a burning fire in his body that he is unable to contain. The key word in verses 7 to 12 used 3 times is prevail, which means to overcome. In verse 7, Yahweh prevails over Jeremiah. In verse 10, Jeremiah's enemies are looking to prevail, but here it is determined that Jeremiah's enemies will not be able to prevail. Jeremiah's lamenting is broken for a moment by doxology. The prophet gives way to praise and breaks into song. How can Jeremiah sing in the midst of his afflictions? Jeremiah states that he sings because Yahweh delivers the soul of the poor. This word is used to describe the destitute, the day laborers of the ancient world who were completely dependent on others for their survival. What is delivered is the needy soul, not the needy body. In the midst of afflictions, people must depend on Yahweh. The reason Jeremiah laments so deeply lies in this question. Why was I ever born if all I experience is trouble and sorrow? What a contrast to Yahweh's statement to Jeremiah in his youth when he promised he knew Jeremiah in his mother's womb in chapter 1, verse 5. At one time, Jeremiah had hope, purpose, and direction. But his life has become a series of afflictions. Sorrow is the only thing he knows. Instead of receiving a word of assurance from Jeremiah, Zedekiah receives a word of judgment. The power who did wonderful things for Israel in the Exodus will now stand against the nation. Furthermore, Nebuchadnezzar will kill Zedekiah and the rest of the war's survivors. It will be up to the people whether they stay in the city and die or are exiled to Babylon to live. Yahweh makes his plan for Jerusalem and its inhabitants clear. It will be overtaken by the enemy and burned. After the word of judgment, there is an exhortation for the king. The king is supposed to uphold justice and righteousness and the rights of the poor, the needy, and the afflicted. He is to uphold the integrity of the court system so that innocent blood will not be shed. This chapter relates to the stories of 4 kings: Josiah, Shalawam, Jehoiakim, and Coniah, who not only forsake the Lord, but are also guilty of not doing the things they were supposed to do according to the law and the word of Yahweh. These leaders of Judah exalted themselves and exploited the people for their own personal gain. Yahweh sends Jeremiah directly to the palace to deliver clear directions to the nation's leaders, dispense justice and righteousness, and care for the socially weak and powerless. The king's conduct is decisive for the wealth or woe of the entire social system. If he acts according to Yahweh's command, then his royal power will be guaranteed. If he fails to do so, the house of David will be terminated. Yahweh contrasts 2 images to explain the results of either following his instructions or choosing to disobey them. The kingdom will be plush and fertile if the leaders obey, or it will be like a desert if they do not. What happens to Judah depends on what the leaders choose to do. But the royal house forsakes Yahweh's covenant, and a description of the judgment to come follows in the text. The first king to succeed Josiah is his son Shalom, also called Jehoahaz, but his reign lasts only 3 short months before he is exiled to Egypt. The second king to follow Josiah is Jehoiakim, another of his sons. Jehoiakim fights against Babylon and enters into a dangerous political exploitation that evokes the anger of that nation. Jehoiakim uses people and exploits the poor to surround himself with comfort and luxury. Jeremiah contrasts Jehoiakim with his father, Josiah, who was just and righteous. After his death, Jehoiakim will be treated like a donkey because of his sin. There will be no funeral or lament. These verses remind listeners of how Yahweh has continually tried to reach out to leaders, but they refuse to listen. They prosper and live in comfort. The mention of cedars refers to houses made of the finest timber available, but their judgment is forthcoming. The third king to follow Josiah is Coniah, also called Jehoiakim and Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim and grandson of Josiah. Coniah begins his rule in 598 BC, but is exiled to Babylon in 597, reaping the curse of his father's corrupt politics. Yahweh claims that if Coniah was a ring on his hand, he would pull it off, ending the relationship between the 2 of them and, consequently, the house of David. Ultimately, this separation happens when Coniah is exiled. With Coniah's exile, the royal line comes to an end and the land is forfeited. Although Coniah has several sons, he might as well have been childless. None of his descendants will succeed him as king. The leaders of Judah are supposed to care for their people as shepherds care for their flocks. However, the kings and other leaders of Jeremiah's day were not good shepherds. Rather, they destroyed and scattered the sheep of Yahweh's pasture. These verses are a word of hope in the midst of great sorrow. Jeremiah's prophecies that Yahweh will bring a leader who will exemplify godly leadership and rule in stark contrast to the four kings previously mentioned in chapter 22. In the midst of failure, the Lord makes a promise to Judah. One is coming who will sit on the throne of David and rule with wisdom, justice, and righteousness. The phrase "a righteous branch" is one that in the Old Testament signals the idea of a Messiah who will fulfill the salvation Yahweh intended for his people. The name of the coming king will be the Lord of Righteousness, and under his rule, both the northern and southern kingdoms will prosper in peace and safety. The focus shifts here from kings to the prophets of Judah, the nation's spiritual leaders. These men occupy a very important position in Israel. They speak in the name of the Lord. As seen in chapter 18, verse 18, Judah's prophets are proclaiming one thing about the spiritual state of the nation, but it conflicts with the words of the Lord that Jeremiah delivered. Jeremiah will be vindicated in time, but in these verses, he has a painful message for the brothers who share his vocation. Their bad leadership has fostered immorality in the nation. Both prophet and priest are profane, polluted, twisted, and defiled, and the holy temple has become the site of sexually oriented fertility rites. Following other patterns throughout Jeremiah, at the end of this statement of sin, Yahweh assures he will judge the false prophets. Jeremiah 23:12. Wherefore their way shall be unto them as slippery ways in the darkness. They shall be driven on and fall therein. For I will bring an evil upon them, even the year of their visitation, saith the Lord. The comparison with Samaria is designed to shame the southern prophets. Judah is worse than Samaria because the idolatry of Jerusalem is more shameful than the Baal worship of Samaria. In fact, the evil so repulses Yahweh that in his eyes Judah is no different than Sodom and Gomorrah. Contrary to what the false prophets teach, Yahweh is capable of being both active in the midst of the people to save and protect them, and holy and just in his dealing with sin. One characteristic of false prophets Yahweh points out is that they simply repeat what they hear each other say. False prophets contrast the word of the Lord like chaff to wheat. The idle dreams and self-induced visions of the false prophets are like chaff. They lack substance. But the word of Yahweh is like wheat. It has a nourishing quality. The word of Yahweh is powerful, like a refining fire that burns within us. It is also like a sledgehammer that shatters selfish dreams and stubborn hearts. Yahweh wants his people to know his rejection of those who speak falsely in his name. Yahweh addresses the false prophets telling of oracles. He reiterates that anyone proclaiming a message in Yahweh's name that isn't from Yahweh will face his punishment. With so many people claiming to be delivering oracles from Yahweh, no one is able to discern his true message. So Yahweh tells Jeremiah to stop using the common phrase, the burden of the Lord, elsewhere translated the oracle of the Lord, in order to discern the true prophets from the false. Yahweh's word to Jeremiah concerning the false prophets closes with the assurance that all the false prophets will be cast from Yahweh's presence in exile and shame. The opening verses of chapter 24 reveal that some captivity has taken place. Sources show that this captivity refers to Nebuchadnezzar taking captives in 597 BC. Jeremiah sees a new image that serves as a message from Yahweh to his people, a basket with good and bad figs. The good figs represent the people who have been promised restoration, and the bad figs are the ones who have not. The frightening message the fig image symbolizes is that for some people, even exile and imprisonment will not return them to Yahweh. The fourth year of Jehoiakim is 605 BC. By this time, Jeremiah has been a prophet for 20 years, so many people have had the opportunity to hear him. Jeremiah has been consistent in the prophecies he has delivered against the people's bad behavior and their worship of false gods, but they still refused to listen. Because of the people's disobedience, Yahweh will send Babylonian forces led by King Nebuchadnezzar to invade Jerusalem from the north. This event is the fulfillment of the invasion Jeremiah has been prophesying about repeatedly throughout the book of Jeremiah. The destruction to the city will be so bad that significant life events, such as marriages and harvests, will cease. After 70 years of punishment, Yahweh will also punish the captors and other nations for the same sins which Judah is guilty. Conquering the Israelites and exploiting its citizens to labor is not just treatment. So even though Yahweh uses the invading nations for his purpose, their actions will not go unpunished. Yahweh invokes another image to symbolize his judgment of nations other than Judah. A cup filled with Yahweh's fury. Yahweh instructs Jeremiah to take the cup of Yahweh's fury to a list of nations for them to consume. Unlike the clay pots Jeremiah broke in front of Judah's leaders in chapter 19, this vision most likely symbolizes the message Yahweh wants to send the sinful nations. The message of drinking to excess is interesting, almost as if there is a connection between the leaders being unable to control themselves and the punishment that they have brought upon themselves. Yahweh makes it clear that the choice to drink of his fury is no longer theirs. Because of their past actions, Yahweh will force them to drink so that they will face the fullness of his fury. The destruction, as previous warnings have stated, will be so great that it will be impossible to bury the dead, much less mourn for them. Yahweh's forthcoming judgment appears to be particularly centered on leaders, those who are shepherding their followers. In chapter 3 and 15, Yahweh endows Judah with a special gift when he says, "And I will give you pastors according to mine heart, which shall feed you with knowledge and understanding." The word pastor is translated elsewhere as shepherds. These shepherds, however, are not the same. They are the leaders of the offending nations. Beginning with the Egyptian Empire, and then the Assyrian Empire, and then the Babylonian Empire, these nations surrounded Judah and sought her destruction. Yahweh invites humiliation upon these proud, arrogant leaders. Their penalty is watching the Lord destroy the shepherd's pasture, the land, agriculture, and prosperity they sought. The final two verses of chapter 25 remind people of how dependent they are on Yahweh. It is his decision when people experience peace or horror. Chapter 25 marks the end of Jeremiah's prophetic warnings of Yahweh's judgment against the people of Judah, which begins in chapter 2. By this point, the Babylonian invasion has taken place, and Yahweh's judgment is being poured out on the nation. The end.